In this video, we're going to talk about ZRe. On your screen, you'll see the character we created in the quick start video. This is a Dynamesh. If we go into frame mode, you can see it's all just tiny little quads on the mesh. And if we go to geometry, you'll see that there are no subdivision levels. So Dynamesh is powerful in that it allows you to create volume on the go. You can add volume with no regard for any sort of limits. You can cut holes in things, you can add new pieces on, but you can't have subdivision levels. Now, subdivision models where you bring in a low resolution cage and then subdivide them up, they typically are limited to the volume of your original mesh. It's very hard to cut holes in them. It's very difficult to blend in new geometry. However, it does have the power where if you want to make big shape changes, you can step down to a lower subdivision level and then make those changes on a much more simple mesh than what we see here. If I make big form changes here, I'm dealing with thousands of polygons at one time. Now what that means is we can create more nuanced form changes by working with a low resolution mesh and then stepping up our subdivision levels and then seeing all of our detail and those form changes follow. You can also pose a low resolution model easier. So if you have subdivision levels, you can step down to a lower subdivision level, use your transpose tools to pose the character, and then step back up. For a very dense mesh like this, it's extremely difficult to pose it and get any kind of clean, nice deformation. When Dynamesh first came out, I was talking to another ZBrush trainer, and we both agreed that it's an incredible tool. It's a paradigm shifting tool. However, it does make it difficult to teach new users why they would ever want to use anything else. There's very strong reasons for using Dynamesh, just like there's very strong reasons for using subdivision modeling, or subdivision sculpting, I guess I should say. The reasoning for using one is not the reason for using another, and you're best placed if you can leverage the power of those two approaches together. That's what I want to communicate to you in this video. We're not just going to learn how to use ZRe, we're going to learn how to use ZRe to bounce our models back and forth between Dynamesh and subdivision sculpting, and allowing you to leverage the power of both approaches, making you all the more effective in ZBrush. So let's get started. First, let's learn about ZRe. ZRe is an automated retopology tool built into ZBrush, which is actually quite remarkable. To start, we're going to take our character here, who is a Dynamesh mesh. I'm going to turn off Dynamesh, go to Subtool, and I'm going to duplicate the head so we now have two copies. Shift-click on the eyeball next to one of them to hide all the other subtools. Now, we've got two copies. We've got the original the original Dynamesh and this one here. We're going to use ZRe on this one to create a lower resolution animatable model. That would allow us then to lay out UVs, to paint the character, and extract displacement maps and texture maps to send to render outside of ZBrush. So let's go down to the geometry menu. Let's go to ZRe, and let's go to this slider here, target polygon count. This is in the thousands, so if it's set to 5, that means 5,000 faces. Let's go ahead and set it to 1.5. That's 1.5 thousand faces. Click ZRe, and you're going to see a progress bar up here at the top of the screen while ZBrush starts to calculate. And it shouldn't take too long. It should buzz right through, and then we're going to have an organized mesh at 1.5 thousand faces in just a few more seconds. There we go. So if we turn on frame mode now, you can see we've got wonderful edge looping going around the eyes, going around the mouth. We have edge flow following the anatomy of the neck here beautifully. So ZBrush has very intelligently placed edge loops in all the recesses and really encapsulated the forms perfectly using the topology. That's going to be incredibly helpful when it comes time to UV and when it comes time to animate and rig. So now that we've got an animation mesh, we need to recapture our detail because obviously this mesh here looks nothing like this mesh here. We want to get this detail into this model. So what we're going to do is we're going to subdivide our remeshed version. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on visibility on the high res so you can see the two are sitting in the exact same space. You can turn on solo at this point because we don't need to see the high res. We just need to make sure that it's turned on. Because we're going to go to Subtool, Project, and we're going to click the Project All button. And what that does is it's going to shrink wrap our current mesh onto the high resolution mesh just beneath it. See, this is our remesh that we just made, and it shrink wrapped itself onto the high res. So let's subdivide again. We're going to press Control D. That adds another subdivision level. And now we're going to click Project All again. And there we go. You see it starts getting more and more detailed every time we add a subdivision level and then shrink wrap it. This distance slider here, this is the projection distance. If for some reason areas get missed, you can change this projection distance in mean to increase the distance and capture some missing details. But most of the time you don't need to use it. These are lined up quite nicely. All right, so let's Control D, divide again, and let's project again. It might take a little bit longer as the mesh gets denser, but it's very important when you do this. Don't divide a bunch of times and then shrink wrap it. Don't project it from 3 subdivision levels to begin because that's too many faces. Start at the first one, project, divide once, project again, divide once, project again. That way there's fewer faces for ZBrush to have to work with each time you project. So look at that. That's looking really nice. I think we can get another one in. So I'm going to Control D one more time, and I'm going to Project All one more time. And we should capture all of that detail that we had in our Dynamesh. And this will be really fantastic because we're going to also have multiple subdivision levels. We can then step down our subdivision levels to our original animation mesh. We can then pose the model, we can UV it, we can step back up, and all of our high resolution details will follow suit and will still be there. So this is denser, so it might just take a little bit longer to do the projection, but if you just leave it be, it should finish. And here we go. That projection is now finished. So if we switch between our projected version and our original, you can see that there is no discernible difference. You can't tell the difference between these two models. However, our reprojected version, which is the one on top, if we go to the geometry menu, this has 5 subdivision levels. So look at this. I can now step down, back down to level 1, and there's our animation mesh. If we press the D key, we can step back up. Shift D steps us back down. So this is great because now we can step down our subdivision levels. And if we want to make big changes, we can do that down here. So maybe I want to change the shape of the back of the head. Maybe I want to grab these points and just pull them out a bit. Maybe I want to change the shape of the crest of the head here. And then step back up our subdivision levels. All that detail follows suit. What's more, I can step down, and then let's say I want to use transpose to pose the head. So I can mask down the neck. Draw a transpose line, raise the head. Oops, turn off X symmetry. We could move the head around in ways that we could not do if we hadn't reduced the subdivision levels. Go to transpose rotate, drag that line up, bring this forward, go to rotate. Here we can rotate the neck. That would be very, very difficult for us to do on a really dense model. So if we return to the high resolution here and then try to make those same changes, watch what happens. First off, we can't really get a soft blend on our masking. And then if I try and rotate here with the same transpose line, see we get a really harsh edge there. It doesn't give us the same smooth effect. If I rotate the neck here and then step up our subdivision levels, all of our detail follows suit, so we get a much more natural pose here. So we'll turn off solo now, and I'll just turn off visibility on the high resolution, turn on visibility on the eyes, the horns, and the teeth and the mouth. Now we'll step back up our subdivision levels. So what I would do is I would continue working. I would, carry on from this point, continue sculpting and detailing the character. I treat Dynamesh as a tool for generating volumes. I generate the volume of my character using Dynamesh, and once that volume is in place, I quickly then switch over to subdivision sculpting by using ZRe and projections like we just did. And then if someone comes along and says, hey Maddie, we need you to add an extra horn to the character, I'll simply Dynamesh it again. I might need to turn my Dynamesh resolution up if I've got more detail, so I'll probably have to turn up my Dynamesh resolution here. I'll Dynamesh the character again, do what needs to be done, and then I'll repeat the process. I'll duplicate the head, remesh it, reproject it, and bounce it right back to a subdivision model. So basically, if you're not going to 3D printing, and even if you are going to 3D printing, I think it is important to create a subdivision model just for the form questions we were talking about. But I would always need to create an animation topology with multiple subdivision levels. Otherwise, there's no way to get this model out of ZBrush and then render it and animate it in another program. Because the rigger has to be able to rig a character, and they need a lower resolution to do that. Texture artists need to have UVs, and that has to be done on a lower resolution mesh. And making the maps requires those UVs, and you're just not going to be able to get that and polypaint effectively on, an extremely dense mesh. So let's go ahead and do the same on the horns here. I'm going to select the horns, and this is a good opportunity to show you another tool that's part of ZRe. I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to duplicate the horns. I'm going to hide everything else. Now let's say your ZRe meshing is missing out on the tip of something, or let's say that you've got a specific way that you want the edges to flow. You can use guide curves. So if you go to B for brush, Z for ZRe, there is ZRe guides. These draw curves on the surface of the model, just like this. So if I drag my cursor along, it creates a nice curve, like so. Now, if your brush is turned down really low, the curve has a higher resolution. I usually like to keep it turned up pretty high, so it's a bit easier for me to go dot, 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 dot along a surface like that. So that's just a guide curve. That's going to tell ZBrush when it goes to remesh this. It's going to say, hey, make sure that your edges follow this flow down the horn. Now I might want to do another curve down here. Let's say that ZBrush was missing out at the end of the horn here. So I'll come in here, draw another curve. I'll start drawing it across the edge here, but I'm going to hold and press the Shift key, and that will snap a ring of curve around the base of the horn here. So now if I let go, there's a curve running around the base of the horn. I want to make sure that this crosses it. There we go. Now let's go to the tip. This is where it's most important. A lot of times when you're remeshing, it'll miss the very, very tip of something pointy. So if you want to make sure it doesn't do that, zoom in and turn your draw size down. And we'll do the exact same thing. We're just going to draw a little curve that runs along the tip here. So I'm going to start drawing a curve and then press the Shift key, and that'll just snap a loop that goes right around the tip of the horn. Just make sure that we cross over it with that, and those are some guide curves there. You could also use guide curves on the face. Let's say, for example, you wanted to make sure that edge loops followed a specific way around the eye. You could come in here, you could draw the edge loop where you want it. I'm just going to draw it around, and then I'm going to connect it to itself manually just by drawing the point close to it. We can draw another curve that runs the outermost edge here. Then I'll just bring lines that transverse through like this. Now if I want to get rid of any of these little hanging edges here, hold down the Alt key and then click and drag, just draw a curve, through what you want to delete. So I'm holding the Alt key and I'm drawing a curve that crosses right through the ones I want to erase. Now if I turn on the X symmetry, I'll get the same mesh on either side. Now that's important. If I'm remeshing something that's asymmetrical, don't remesh it with X symmetry turned on, because it will disregard the asymmetry of your model and it will create a symmetrical cage for you. If you're remeshing something asymmetrical, make sure your X symmetry is turned off before you run ZRemesher. Now, these guide curves, these don't work like a retopology tool. You don't want to use these to come in here and sort of draw exact edge loops. It's not meant to do that. These are guides. They're called ZRemesher guides. Think of them as suggestions to the automated remeshing tool. If you want to draw really specific topology, then watch the video on the topology brush, because that allows you to draw a very, very specific topology. That's not the purpose of the guides. The guides are there just to help ZBrush say, hey, look, I need you to make sure you put an edge here, and I need you to make sure you put an edge around here. But if ZBrush looks at your target polygon count and looks at the volume and it can't do that, it still won't. So it's just a way of trying to suggest to ZBrush, can you please try and do this? If we go down here to the ZRemesher options, go under Geometry, ZRemesher. There is a slider here called Curve Strength, and it's set by default to 50%. If you turn this up, it will increase the strength of these curves to influence the remeshing tools. Use that carefully, because if you turn it all the way up, you might as well be doing manual remeshing, because ZBrush is going to fail in its remeshing, because it's going to try and create something that's however many thousand faces representing this volume and putting the edges where you're asking for them. But if it can't do that mathematically, if you turn this slider up, it's just going to make a bad mesh. So just keep that in mind. You can tinker with this a bit, but be aware if you push it too far, it's just going to break down the mesh. So let's go ahead now and run ZRemesher. So I'm going to go ahead and click ZRemesher. It's going to look at those horns and then do its best in remeshing. And here we go. Now, it has done that at 5,000 faces, which is way too much. So we're going to undo that. We're going to set this target polygon count to 0.5. That would be 500 faces. Now let's run that again and see what we get. And there we go. That's a fair bit better, but we could probably go even lower than that, to tell you the truth. So I'm going to undo that, and let's set this down to let's do 0.2. 200 faces is good. ZRemesh it. There we go, much better. Now, you see that we have the option to set a target polygon count, or you can set it to half size, same size, double size, or adaptive density. I never use these buttons down here. I simply always set my target polygon count. So we're going to undo that again, and I'm just going to set it down to 0.1. ZRemesh it. There we are. So now we've retopologized those horns. It's placed the loop there at the tip as we asked it to, and it made sure to place loops down here at the edges. It really wasn't going to run out of geometry, so there wasn't much danger in it missing out on that. But if you're working with something that has lots of tentacles or lots of antlers or long spiny bits, it's very handy to use that control to go in there and add loops to make sure that it captures the end of something or the tips of things. So now we'll do the exact same thing we did before. We've got our two antlers here, or two horns, I should say. I'm going to divide, project all. Divide, project all. Divide, and project all. Divide, and project all. So before we complete this look at ZRemesher, there's one more tool I want to show you. If we go down to Geometry, ZRemesh, here it is Use Polypaint. I'm going to turn this on, and that's going to enable this color density slider. I'm going to make sure that I'm on the standard brush and RGB is turned on. What this does is it allows you to paint color regions that will then attract or repel polygons. So for example, if I turn this down to a shade of blue, watch my color slider here. It goes towards blue. If I move this up, it goes towards red. As you move towards blue, you reduce the amount of polygons that you get. As you move towards red, you increase the amount of polygons you get. You want to stay away from extreme colors here. I'm going to go down towards sort of a bluish tint, and I'm going to go to Color, Fill Object, and that fills the object with kind of this bluish hue. Let's do this. Color, Fill Object. Here we go. I'm actually going to make that a bit, set it to 0.6. Color, Fill Object. There we go. So we get a very pale, pale blue. Now I'm going to turn it up towards red. Don't turn it all the way up. Turn it up just a little bit. And then we're going to paint this reddish hue in the face. And even that's a bit too much. So let's turn that down. It's going to be more of a pale pink. Everywhere where you've got this pale pink color, you're going to attract polygons. As I turn this down, maybe I'll set this down to 1.9 so we can create a little fall off here. We're going to end up feathering towards that blue. So I'm going to go back down towards blue now. Oops, there we go. The idea being I want to cluster the densest geometry in the face. Just as an example, I want you to see that the face gets the densest geometry, and then as we move back towards the back of the head, we get less geometry. So this is really effective if you've got areas that you need to cluster your detail, and then areas that don't need as much detail, like maybe it's hidden under a shirt, or just the design of the character doesn't call for as much detail in one area as opposed to another. This allows you to have that level of control. This is very similar to something that you're going to see later on when we have our video on UV Master, Automated UV's layout in ZBrush. So let's go ahead and press ZRemesher now, and you'll see the effect of this. It might take a little bit longer for it to calculate the ZRemesh because we've set it up with a polypaint, because it is adding those extra variables. But here again, it's going to create a 1,500 face mesh, taking into account that polygon paint that we put in there to guide where we want the density. There we are. So we go into frame mode now. You can see we've got all this detail clustered into the face. Then as we move towards the back of the head, it's lighter and lighter. Now this is a very specialized tool. It's not something that you're going to use very often. Most of the time I don't think it's something you need to use. It's only under very specialized circumstances. If you need to have that degree of control over where your detail is clustered, you can do that with polypaint here. So the main thing is I want you to be aware that it's there. But 9 times out of 10, the standard ZRemesher using a target polygon count slider, that's all you need to get the meshes that are going to serve your purposes. I've done a lot of using just ZRemesher with the default polygon count slider for actually creating production meshes that have gone into motion pictures. So it's an extremely powerful tool. It's very, very smart on its own. And this is just an extra little bell and whistle in those rare cases where you might actually need it. So that completes this look at ZRemesher. Let's go back to a better looking mesh here. There we go. So that completes this look at ZRemesher. Hopefully you've enjoyed seeing how to remesh your models and bounce back and forth between Dynamesh and subdivision modeling. And I stress once again before we close this video out, it is the most effective for you as an artist in ZBrush if you can leverage the power of both Dynamesh and subdivision sculpting. For those new users watching this video, I can't stress that enough. Become comfortable using both techniques and become comfortable mixing them together using this technique, and there's nothing you can't do in ZBrush. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.